So this is more of some of the basic things that one needs to consider in design of UI UX, as well as even generally in design of products. But more than that, it's also the underlying idea of semiotics is very fundamental to how we understand reality, how we see the world. So it's a very philosophical sort of problem. And that's where my challenge lies today, because when I talk about semiotics in the product design course, which is currently running as well, so we do it for the entire course. So it's a 1 semester discussion on semiotics, and starting with a lot of examples first, and then we go into the theory. And semiotics, the origin of semiotics, or a lot of work in semiotics, actually happened in or happens in the area of linguistics, because language is one of the most fundamental modes of representation, right? So that's one way. In fact, there are claims that you can only think about the world in terms of language. So if I ask you to pause and think about anything, you'll realize that everything that you think around is based on the language that you have, right? So whatever is your native language, whatever, you cannot think of the world outside of language, right? So it becomes extremely critical, because then language is determining how you see the world, how you view the world. And similarly, when you design, or when you interpret design, or when you see anything, what you do is essentially you want to make sense of the world, or whatever is the stimuli that you are getting. And that sense making is again driven by some fundamental characteristics which determine how you design things, and how you interpret things, and how interactions happen, right? So I'm going to talk about those aspects, and I believe it could be very tricky in 1 hour. I'm not necessarily sure that I'll be doing justice within this 1 hour on this topic, but I hope that at least it will leave you interested in it. I'm most likely very confused as well of what this lecture was about. And you might be scratching your head saying, I'm not sure what was delivered. But let's see how it goes. And then I hope as you interact, we'll hopefully get some things out of it. And hopefully you'll have more interest in looking more into the topic, right? And somewhere we'll touch upon the relevance to design UI UX, though we'll not go directly in any of those specifically. So we'll largely stick to semiotics. But before we start, it's good to generally sort of talk about some experiences, in the sense your own experiences, just for us to sort of understand each other, and it might as well be fun. So let me ask a question, and I hope everybody is active in responding. So if you do not respond, the whole fun of this discussion goes away, right? So this lecture should be more interactive to whatever extent. I have too many slides as well, so that is another limitation, but I'll try to go as fast as possible wherever applicable. So let me ask you a question. Has anyone ever shot a bird? Any of you? And please respond.
No, sir.
No one has shot a bird. Okay. So let me now ask the question again. Has any of you ever shot a bird?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So now when I ask this question, I'm putting the camera option there as well. So let me again. I'll keep coming back to, so what happened now? In the first instance, what did you think when I asked the question? Did you think of, most likely most of you thought about me asking about shooting with a gun, is that right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Right, so why did that happen? Why did you assume that the short word there was related to shooting with a gun rather than a camera? So you were predisposed in some way, right? So your thoughts were aligned in a particular order. And because the question seemed rhetorical, so there were many cues that I left potentially in my asking a simple question, right? And that led you to a particular way of thinking, and you responded in that way. Now imagine that instead of me asking this question here, if this was already stated as a class or a lecture on photography, and if I had asked you a question, have you ever shot a bird? Would you have that confusion?
No, sir.
Most likely not, right? So what it tells you is that the word, I mean, of course, the short here, we know that it has multiple meanings, but So the meaning is not necessarily in that word short, but is in the context in which the word is used, right? Does it make sense?
Vishal, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt.
Yeah.
Could you please pin yourself?
Sorry, I didn't get you.
Can you please pin yourself so your
In
face?
myself. Oh, all right. Okay, okay. Just a moment. And where do I do that? In myself. Just one moment. Spotlight me, is it?
Yeah, there is a one. You can just right click on your video or the icon bottom right, and right click and select pin.
Okay, it's not showing me pin option, but it's spotlight me it shows. So
Yeah,
is that what you want?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Right. So I lost track of what I was saying, but so yeah, so the idea is that the interpretation of or the meaning is not in the word, but is in the context. Now, if you can extend the same sort of basic understanding to everything that you do, right? What you say and how it's being interpreted, it's always in the context, and that is something that is a theme that will continue to repeat in this lecture. Partly because when you design or when you do anything, you have a perspective which is based on your understanding of the context. And you have the receiver or the person who's the audience for whom you are designing or the person you are communicating with have their own context. And it's very common how we are so used to the context that we absolutely overlook the importance of the context and how interpretation happens in whatever we do, right? So we'll continue to look at a few more examples and similarly take the discussion forward. Right, so now let's go to the next example. So I'm assuming that everyone has some familiarity with CAD applications, right? Is that correct? Is there anyone who has not done any CAD applications?
No, sir, we are familiar with the CAD applications.
Okay. All right, so this is a familiar symbol, right? So this is, let's say, even those who might have either seen any floor plans or otherwise, you see these kind of symbols, right? This is, what is this? Anyone, any volunteer would. Is this a door?
Yeah, I think I would want to answer. I'm not aware of much of the CAD, but I think this is the door.
Right, you're right. So this is a door, and then we have this convention that this is a masonry wall, right? So what happens is that over a period of time, just like language, I mean, this is also language, right? This is a language which architects use or civil engineers use, and that's a language where we have agreed on certain symbols which represent some things, and we have agreed on conventions on how to interpret them. And based on these, it's easier to communicate. So if somebody draws this, it clearly communicates to the other person what it is. Right, so the way we deal with representations in many fields, including language, of course, is that we create symbols and we have conventions. And conventions and norms work in a given context. So now if you take, for example, we go to normal language, verbal language that we use. So if you use, let's say, Kannada here, everyone understands. If you use Kannada in, let's say, another state or another country, probably people will not necessarily understand because they're not aware of those symbols and do not have it part of their conventions as such. So the context changes and symbols and conventions that work in one context may not work in other. For instance, if you take it to somebody who's never seen a floor plan or it has nothing to do with civil engineering architecture, might have some doubts on the difference between this hatch and some other hatch on a wall. Or if you give, for example, electrical engineering drawing or a circuit drawing to somebody who's never done electrical engineering, for instance, they might struggle with what exactly means what, right? So we have symbols and conventions. We have the context in which it is used. And of course, with the period of time, as you see with language, representations change and evolve. And that depends also on various other things, including the medium, right? And we'll come to that as we go. So accordingly, the representations change and we need to be aware of, and their importance and usage changes, and we need to be aware of that. Now, as I go along, I'll give examples from different things, but I would like you to try and connect to what you are doing. Similarly, if you think of UI UX, there are many best practices, many icons which are standard, a lot of symbols which are standard and they are regularly used. And there's a convention that's already been established. So you cannot totally ignore the convention. You must be aware of the symbols and the conventions. Of course, there's possibility to create ones, but creating symbols is another issue. We'll come to that. And its acceptance as well. So now I'll just continue with the CAD, given that I had some slides on this and also that's my background partly. So let's play some more game before we come to the theoretical part. So what is this? Any guesses will do. 2 guesses and I'll move on to the next question. So would you call this symbol? So it's a symbolic, potentially symbolic representation. I'm not calling it symbolic and I'll come to why I'm not calling it symbolic. But this is a 2D drawing, which is a common way of doing representation in CAD. We used to do drafting, right? So what is this 2D drawing of? Any guesses? There's no right or wrong answer, so feel free to guess. We are just quickly moving through some ideas. No volunteers?
Probably a window.
Sorry, could you be louder, please?
A window.
A window, right? Very good. Any other guess? All right, let's take that potentially as a window, right? So now I've given you a 3D view of the same thing. So now, of course, when I make a 3D view, it requires a lot more effort on my part, right? It's not as simple as drawing this. So I moved from a 2D CAD to doing a 3D perspective. Now, can you tell me what is this?
Can be a microwave oven.
Potentially a microwave oven, right? Now I've put in a little more detail, I put in more effort, right? So as I go along, every time it requires more effort on my part. Now I have detailed it further with more details, going beyond the concept to more specific details. So it's clearer now, right? What is this? Monitor or a TV, right? And so on. So I moved from something which was an abstract representation to a more concrete representation. And here I have got a photorealistic rendering of that. Now, if you look at the evolution of CAD, that is also what has happened. We used to have tools which were largely for 2D drawing. Then we started giving 3D modeling, and in 3D modeling, we started to have photorealistic rendering. And then we moved on to CAD models which have actual objects. So these are, if I can take from the object library a screen of this kind, which will have all its details. It will have details of its brand, model, color, and all that, right? And so what has happened is we moved into representations, which was easier for the person doing the design or communicating it. And of course, for the person receiving the design, so that they had all the information available to them. And accordingly, the user experience, user interface, all that changed. I won't go into those details. But what has happened over a period of time, we moved from, tried to move from as abstract representation to as close to virtual things or objects, right? We are now in the era where we talk about virtual reality. We are talking about digital twin, right? So that's also an evolution you can see from 2D CAD to virtual digital twin. Why are we moving there? Of course, there must be some motivation behind it, right? And there must be some belief that it's useful to move into things which are closer to virtual things or the virtual objects rather than leaving things abstract and symbolic, right? I've put a question mark on symbolic here, largely because this is not really symbolic, even though it's abstract, because symbols need to be agreed upon, right? So unless you can have things abstract, but it may still not be a symbol because a symbol must be accepted within the community. So there must be a general agreement. So now let's say if we had agreed that this was going to be a symbol for this, then I would have had no confusion because you would have been very familiar, just like a hospital, for instance, right? For a hospital, you use a plus sign. And if I leave it as a plus sign, you say whether it's a medical or hospital, you immediately identify with it, right? So I don't need to then create a hospital as a sketch, or I don't need to really show it, because the moment I show plus, you immediately recognize that it. So when symbols become common and symbols get accepted, they're as good as the thing because they immediately start referring to the thing. It becomes part of your, and that's how you use icons and other things in your interfaces as well as in many of the communication that we do, right? So it's good to sort of continue to, we'll continue to look at these and then we'll see if we can make sense of all of this when we start going into the theory part. So I'll again go a bit further, and this is again in continuation with the CAD drawings that we just talked about. So now if we think about representation, because what we are doing essentially is we talked about representation here, we in this in the case of these things as well, it was also a representation. In the case of when I asked, have you ever shot a bird, that was also about representations. We are essentially in our current discussion largely looking at representations, right? So what is pragmatically desired in a representation? So pragmatics relates to sensible things. What is, what makes sense? What is the practical thing to do, right? So a practical thing to do in representation is that we want it to be efficient, that it should be clear, disambiguous, and distinct, which was the problem when I asked, have you ever shot a bird? That was not very clear. Even though I thought I was clear, we clearly saw that the communication wasn't clear because the word shot in that sense was ambiguous. So we would like to avoid that, right? When I put the image of the camera or the gun, it became clear that there could be two different meanings. Similarly, I would like to reduce effort, volume, cost, and time. If I can get a message through without putting too much effort, that's more desirable, right? Because any additional effort requires more volume, more cost, and time, which means that if I can use a symbol to get my message through, I do not need to make a 3D drawing, or I do not need to make a 3D rendering, right? So you want to be efficient. You do not want to do more work than what is needed. Then, of course, we would like it to be deliverable so that and skill-wise easier, so that if we use a language in a community, it should be an easy language so that everyone can use. You do not want to be non-inclusive, right? You want to be inclusive. By inclusive, you want to keep it at a level where everyone can do it, and so on. So you have, and then you want to be comprehensive, that your message should be as complete as possible, so that you do not leave, things to be asked or things to be. And that's where if I can, instead of using a 2D plan or 2D sketch of something, if I can actually send the object, it would be better, because then everything about the object can be figured out by the person or the receiver who's receiving the information, right? Eventually, if you are using symbols, and we talked about having a common ground, that is, people share the same context so that they are aware of the symbols, they are aware of the conventions, and then decode the symbol. Then they can decode the symbols. And one way to, if the common ground in terms of the symbols does not exist, one way to address that is to move away from abstraction, which is symbolic, to coming as close to the thing. So if I am using a digital twin, for instance, which is largely as close a representation to the actual thing in the current technologies, then potentially anyone without necessarily a language barrier would understand the same things, right? So all of that leads to things like a level of detail, how much information you have, what is the purpose, and the context of use, and then of course you come with standards where you agree that this is how we are going to do things. And there's assumption of familiarity. So if you know that people are familiar with symbols, for instance, then you can have less effort and get more things done. So far, are we okay, or am I moving too fast?
It's okay, sir.
All right. Okay, so let me give you another example. This is again the work of one of my PhD students. And he started with this topic where he was looking at kind of, I would not say, well, you can call it digital twin in the same sense. He was looking at maintenance of, he was developing a platform for facilities management and maintenance. How do you maintain a facility? And this was a platform developed for people who manage facilities, so facility management users. So these are, based on the same sort of discussions that was in the literature as well as the discussion in the community, there was clearly a requirement that it will be desirable to have the 3D models of the facility so that people can find the information. So his first attempt at developing the platform was driven largely through this 3D view. built on the assumption that 3D provides all the information. It will be easier for people to exactly figure out what they are interested in. So this was a 3D first approach, where the user could go into the specific objects, figure out the objects, click on it, and then navigate through a visual search platform, and then find the relevant information, right? As we did the further implementations and further case studies and pilots with the community that is actually going to use the users, we realized that the 3D first approach wasn't particularly useful. Even though the requirement for 3D came, the 3D was not easy to navigate because these were people who had very little background in 3D platforms or CAD platforms. These were regular users, non-technical users, and then they were very familiar with 2D floor plans. So gradually moved into the next level of iteration for the platform. So the UI changed from 3D centric view to a multi-view sort of thing. And in further iterations, as they moved along, it became much simpler 2D platform. Even this was simplified further. I won't go into details, but the point being is that it's often very easy to get swayed away by your perception of what the user wants. And the requirement of adding more and more meaning to it, more and more, technology affords a lot of possibilities where you think that now we can provide more details and what looks like the thing in the as close to the reality. But as we discussed earlier, sometimes the symbols become almost equivalent to the thing, right? Which was the case of the plus in the case of a hospital or a medical thing, right? In which case the symbolic representation for many people is enough, and they might find it easier to deal with the symbolic representation rather than the actual thing being represented there. So again, part of the issue in this research as it evolved, or part of the things that were revealed, was this understanding of the context in which the UI or UX is to be used. And also the interpreter, the person, because their capabilities in terms of what they can understand, what is easier for them to navigate through and all that. I won't go into details of this specific case, but we'll come back again when we discuss about categories of signs that we use. So with that background, I'll come to the topic of today. Right, so the topic of today is semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs, and we'll see what signs mean. In general, we think of signs as signages or signs as symbols largely, or we think of sign when we think of sign languages, right? When we see people communicating in sign language. But everything is a sign in many ways, and I'll come to explaining what I mean by that. My discussion today is largely based on this book. It's one of the relatively easier books to read on semiotics. Semiotics is not one of the easiest topics to read. It's very philosophical, and coming from linguistics, it becomes very sometimes hard on the language side as well. So it takes time to read and reread and try and understand what is being said. And there have been a number of very influential semioticians. People have studied semiotics, including Saucer, Peirce, Morris, and so on. And they have all been sort of referred to in this book. So besides this book, the same author used to maintain an online resource. So a large part of the book is already there in this online resource. The book is, of course, written later. So this came first, the online resource, which was later compiled into a much more cleaner book. I would highly recommend reading this, but this is going to take time. The reading will take time, and also understanding it will take time. It's not the easiest topic to understand. But I would encourage, if you are in early stages of PhD or even in later stages of your PhD, I would encourage you to read it because it changes your perspective on how you see things. So in fact, I had also not looked into semiotics in depth earlier. I'd of course looked at representation for the purpose of my research and signs and symbols to some extent. But the more I delve into semiotics, the more it raises more fundamental questions. So I have more questions than answers at the moment, But I believe once you start reading it, you'll find it useful as well. So I would highly encourage you to go there and read it. So I'll take some bits of it here. And as I said, it might leave you more confused than having resolved the ideas. So what I'll do is I'll go into some of the more seminal works or dominant models in semiotics, connect with some of the ideas there, and we'll see how that flows. So here what we have here is a thing or a concept which we call as a tree, right? So that's the tree. So what Saucer's model is dyadic. So he talks about something as a thing in the world and a representation of it that we use. Now it's very easy to think of this as the sign that represents this, but we'll see that it's not necessarily the case. So the way Saucer defines these is that this is the signifier. So the tree is a signifier that is signifying this concept. So this becomes the signified. So this is the concept to which this refers to, the signifier refers to, and collectively we create the sign. So the sign, this is not the sign, but the sign is the interaction of the whole, which is created between the connection between this text tree and this concept of a tree, right? You need to go deeper. It will. The whole idea here again is so the sign is the combination of these, and there are directions in arrows in both sides. What it indicates is, of course, is that this refers to this, but this also our understanding that this is a tree is not outside the realms of the language. So it was only because we created a language that we formulated the concept of a tree, right? So the claim here is that the tree by itself as an object does not exist. In the sense, there is some object, but whether you call it tree or whether you call it free, that was a choice between us, right? So different languages have used different signifiers to refer to something that is there, but it's not the same thing, right? Again, it will confuse you here, but it's important because it's the same, largely similar to what we talked about in the case of short. So it's always in the context, right? So if you use the word tree to refer to this in a community which doesn't use, which has a different language system entirely, they will not understand what you are referring to, right? So which means that this is not absolute. It has a concept attached to a particular language. And the same happens when you design, when you take a perspective, and if this other person does not, now I'm asking you to make a leap of faith here in the conceptual understanding of the links I'm making between a signifier and signified here to what you do in design. But if you are able to connect these dots, you'll see that the same problem happens in design as well. So you do something with some clear connection between what you have created and what is the concept that you want to communicate. But if the other person does not share the same connection or same relationship between the concept you have and what you have represented it with, then you will have a problem. And we'll see potentially examples of that. So the thing becomes a little clearer when we look at it in terms of expression. So the tree or the word tree is an expression or a form in English language. And the content it connects to is the physical object which we understand as tree, right? So that's the thing, right? Now this is where it's clarified further. So it appears that the expression has a content, and the content holds the meaning, right? So the tree, the physical tree we are talking about as the concept, holds the meaning, and all that language is doing is to point towards that. So it looks like we are labeling a thing that exists in reality. But the claim here in semiotics is that the idea that there is a fixed reality is not necessarily true. So the meaning is not in the content, but the meaning is in how we extract it with respect to the interpretation, right? So it's not true that the word tree contains that or the content of the tree, right? So the meaning is always in the interpretation rather than the actual thing that is there. We'll come to that as we go along, hopefully. The I'll go to some of the other models of, so there are two dominant models of semiotics. So we talked about sources model, right, which is signifier and signified. What is important in this model as well is that signifier and signified, as we discussed about the tree and the interpretation, is always done by a interpreter. There's somebody who's doing the signification, connecting the signifier to the signified, right? So this interpretation is an important part because that leads us to the second model of which is the second dominant model. But before we do that, just to kind of reiterate that, for example, the word tree belongs to the language system which we call as English, and it only makes sense within that language system in connection to the other words that are there in the English language system, right? So any signifier signified relationship is within the context of a particular system in which that relationship is established, right? So if we think of Hindi, for example, then it becomes paid, and paid is within the context of the language system which is in Hindi. So that paid makes sense to referring to that concept of tree in Hindi, but similarly, if you think of it in English, it's something else, because if you use paid in English, it won't make sense, right? So things make sense within a larger context in which it is used and within the system in which it's established. Again, goes back to the idea of context, goes back to the idea of conventions, and that applies to your design and everything else that we do. Now, by bringing in the idea that there's an interpretation happening between the object, what it's represented by, that is the signifier. This is where the second dominant model of semiotics comes, which is the triadic model. So dyadic model only looked at these two, maybe using different words, signifier and signified. In the triadic model, the words used were slightly different. So you have interpretant, and so you don't need to worry about the word. But the idea is essentially that you're looking at it from the interaction between these three. Something which allows the sense making. You have something that represents it, and what is being represented, which is the object of interest or the content, right? So representamen is the form which the sign takes, object to which it refers to. What is clarified here is that interpretant is not the interpreter necessarily, it is the process of interpreting. So it's the sense making process, or how the sense is made. So just to give you an example, and this will clarify what we mean by sign here, right? So the idea that the traffic light sign for stop, which is the red light, signifies stop in traffic light, that's the sign of stop, right? How do we get that? So if you think of representamen, so what you have is a red light facing the traffic at an intersection. At the same time, in order to understand that to happen, the object of interest must be that you must see when the red light is on that the vehicles have stopped. If the red light is green, the light is green, and the vehicle, and then so you need to have this differentiation that that is noticeable. That for you to, unless you are already aware of, which you are aware of course, that red light means stop. If somebody has not seen that and is to make sense that red means stop, for that person to interpret that connection between red light said stop and so red light says stop, they need to have all these three things happening at the same time, right? So which is that they should be able to observe a situation where there is a red light at the traffic. When the red light is there, the vehicle stop. In order to recognize that it's only when the red light is there, vehicle stop, they should also see the other possibilities. When the red light is not on, the vehicles are continuing, and every time the red light is on, the vehicle stops. So this interaction must be observable. And from there, the one should be able to make this interpretation that the idea that a red light indicates that vehicles must stop, right? So in order to be able to make that sense, all these three things must happen, right? Now, we are taking a specific case, but I would like you to sort of try and connect later on. I mean, of course, we are still trying to absorb all these ideas. And the same thing happens when we look at the interactions. The problem is that many of these are so obvious to us. We are so used to doing that, this interpretation, representation, and the connection to an object or a referent, that we fail to see the interpretation process. We fail to see the context, and we fail to see all this interaction that is going on. It becomes so transparent to us. It becomes part of our daily life. And when things become so obvious, so part of our daily life, that is where the challenges lie, because we make mistakes by overlooking them and their implications and their role in interpretation and meaning formation. And that continues on when you design and all. Now, just to clarify that, when we are talking about these, the representation is not the sign. It's just a sign vehicle. What you have here, so there are different ways people have tried to clarify that. So this is not the interpreter, but it's about sense making, and the object, the concept is essentially a referent, and it could mean different things to different people depending on which sign vehicle is used and how you make sense. So there's nothing absolute about this either. All of this collectively create the sign, and in that sense we leave a lot of cues about things that are there. Okay, so now, so far we are all right. Is it okay, or is it already too confusing to move further?
It's
Sorry, could you repeat that?
It's okay, sir. We can go ahead, sir.
Okay, all right. All right, so now if you look at a person who's interpreting or who's observing, there can be three levels of observation or three levels of distinction being made. One could be the focus itself on the sign vehicles, or I mean, in some sense, the sign. So that's the first thing the observer may observe, which is focus on the sign. Or they could, through the sign, they could focus on the object, right? So when you think of, for example, the plus sign for a hospital, you might just think about the sign itself, and that could be of interest to you. Or when you think of that plus sign, you might think of a hospital, or you might think of medicine, whatever. That means you are focusing on the on what is being referred to, or you could be focusing on the interpretation that the plus sign indicates or refers to something which is related to medicine or health, right? So there can be three levels of interaction that can happen. So let me give you an example here. Again, this is a very common example in the literature on semiotics. And this is a painting called The Treachery of Images. It's a 1929 painting. And on the painting itself, in French, it is written, "This is not a pipe." Right? So how would you interpret this painting? Okay, in the interest of time, I will move forward, right? So there can be different interpretations. So somebody can look it as a painting. So say that, okay, this is actually a painting. This is then the next level could be, this is the painting of a pipe. Or one could say, so what is the interpretation is, this is the painting of a pipe. So this is not actually a pipe, right? Then somebody could say, okay, this is, when it is written, this is not a pipe, it is actually written about this text. So this is a pipe potentially, but this is not a pipe, and so on. So there can be, what you are focusing on, one could be, is what is the sign, that is the painting itself. What is being referred to in the sign, the painting potentially is the object, and the interaction between the painting and the object, I'm trying to make sense of that. So there can be different levels of this, right? So let me kind of try and explain this just for the ease of, I guess I'm losing people in terms of I'm moving too fast from that point of view. So let's assume that, okay, you have written an app, right, which sort of does a web search and you have written a crawler to look for images of pipes, right? So I look for a pipe, and then in that pipe I'll get both the images of pipes, which are basically photographs. I could see animations or videos of pipes, or I could see photographs of pipes, right? Now somebody might, or paintings of pipes. Now, for the purpose of my activity, I might be interested in what I would like to believe is real pipes, not the painting of pipes. Then this image will not fit into my the shortlisted images that have come to my selection, right, based on my image search. So now the question is that if your algorithm is written to look for things which are which look like a pipe, it may not be able to necessarily distinguish between a painting of a pipe versus a photograph of a pipe or a video of a pipe. It will look for anything which has a pipe in it, right? Whereas my requirement might be more specific than that, right? Because my focus is not to look for a painting of a pipe, but actually a physical, what I believe is an actual pipe, which is, we tend to believe that a photograph is a realistic representation of a pipe rather than a painting, right? And so on. So, so depending on what the person is looking for, some things may fit into their requirements and others may not. So the level of interpretation again becomes important. So why is semiotics important? Because what it tells us is reality is neither purely objective nor independent of human interpretation. So in the context of design, it's extremely important, as well as in the context of UI UX, because there's no absolutely, there's no singular answer to a good UI UX or a good design, right? It depends on interpretation. And your interpretation is very likely to be different from your user's interpretation. So this is going to be a negotiation where your understanding of their likely way of interpreting your design or likely to interpret what you are communicating becomes important. There's nothing purely objective about it. However, it's what is considered as reality or how it is perceived is part of a system of science, a construction by ourselves and others. So you as a designer will of course be designing things, including the interface and potentially influencing the experience. But that must be done within the conventions that are established within the community and within the society that you are going to design for. Similarly, meaning is not contained in the world. It's not even in the books, not computers. If it was true that meaning is contained in books or computers, then everybody would read the same books and understand it the same way, right? We do not understand the same text the same way. It takes us time to understand things. The authors have, as I was saying, the semiotics books are difficult to read. The authors have explained it the best possible way they think they can, but I'm struggling to understand it, right? So similarly, people read the same book, some understand it well, some don't understand it well. But if it was purely contained, the meaning was contained in the book or the computers, then everybody should understand it the same way, right? So which is very clear that meaning is neither contained nor is it transmitted to us. We actively create it according to the interplay of codes and conventions. And often we are not aware of the conventions, which is what I talked about, that we go on a daily basis doing everything based on codes and conventions, but we are so used to it, we do not see them. And when we start being aware of them, that becomes extremely useful, because then you can design better, both your interfaces as well as you can create better user experience. So there are three types of codes that are largely there. Again, I'll come to that. So there are social codes. Social codes include, verbal codes. For example, how I speak, what is my pitch? Am I, using monotone? Am I using varied tone and tenor? That will determine whether you find my lecture boring or interesting, or whether, and so on. So you, whether you find whether I'm being sarcastic or whether I'm actually saying something with seriousness and so on, right? So similarly, you have body codes. We talk about how body language is, and people try to understand that, whether somebody has come too close and so on. So the position and so on. Similarly, commodity codes, which is fashion codes are there, trends are there, which sort of create new codes, and behavioral codes in how we behave and all that, right? Similarly, you have representational codes. In this case, because semiotics literature is largely based on literature in linguistics. And text is textual analysis or the linguistic analysis, typically in form of text related analysis, is very common in semiotics. So there again, you can see the difference, right? So when you read, you have scientific codes. When you write scientific articles, there is a certain way to write, there is a certain way to interpret it, there is a certain belief in it. Something that is written in a scientific article, you believe it more readily than you believe something written in Wikipedia. Where does that come from? All that becomes part of our understanding of conventions, understanding of norms. So codes, in some sense, create, and then of course, in order to have scientific articles, for example, they create certain structure, how you should go about doing it. So there are conventions and codes there as well. Similarly, there are aesthetic codes in how things are presented, style and genre, in how, where, what comes in what form it is used. Then there are media codes, depending on what media you're using. The last one is more debatable, interpretive codes, whether they form really a semiotic code or not. But here comes the idea of perceptual codes, how we perceive things, and especially visual perception is extremely critical here. Then ideological codes is what philosophical or ideological stance you take. Are you a realist? Are you, idealist and all that, or are you a constructivist and all that? I won't go into details of these, and so I'll have it in the slides. I'll share the slides so you can refer to these, but they become extremely important. As I said, codes determine how you analyze things, and they create conventions. So the whole process, and you're of course from, if you think of programming and others, you're very familiar with codes from that point of view. But the whole idea of codes is to create some conventions and some mechanisms through which you can codify things, and then you know how to decode them. That's how we operate, right? So you codify things and decode them. The same happens in our day-to-day life. We just don't observe them that regularly. So I'll skip these slides on the specifics of the social codes, textual codes, and interpretive codes. I'm running really short of time there. So then comes the idea that, which we already talked about, is that we do not analyze things in isolation. We always analyze things as part of a system. And within a particular text as well. So if you think of a sentence or a paragraph or or a book or a chapter, it's an assembly and a composition, right? And that assembly and composition, from a text point of view, it could be words, images, everything that goes in, is constructed by the author and interpreted by the reader with reference to the conventions associated with a genre. So if I write a book, which is, let's say, in fiction, then I write it in a certain way, you interpret it in a certain way. I establish that it's a fiction, so you know that it's not true. And again, the interpretations and all that is determined. Similarly, if I write something in the scientific articles, then I have a certain way to doing it, and your interpretation is focused on assuming many things behind it. I won't go into details again, but you'll notice as you think more about it, is that your interpretation will be influenced by the genre that you have read. So when you're reading, let's say, something on Wikipedia, you will take it with a pinch of salt, but it might still be useful for a quick reference. If you're reading something in a scientific article, in a journal, the article of high repute, then you will take it almost for granted that it's true, right? So we build these associations coming from how things operate. So there are modalities associated with these, and all of that is also influenced by the medium of communication, right? And the medium of communication determines how much how you perceive the thing. For example, if you see a video of something, then you assume it to be more true than a painting or something, because that seems to be more closer to the reality. To a great extent, a lot of people assume that to be reality. And again, there are discussions whether that is reality or not, but I won't go there. So this idea that, when we analyze things, we analyze it as part of a whole. That is a very important and significant part in terms of what is called Gestalt psychology. This by itself requires an extended discussion, and we can have a few lectures on this itself very quickly. So you'll find Gestalt psychology and the different forms of it in terms of how we interpret things, how we see things as part of a whole. So you have this figure ground where you can see either the vase or the face. You have proximity where you have things which are closer, even though they are of similar color, you group them together rather than these. Similarly, you group things based on similarity, a common region and all that. So I won't go into details of these. You'll find, so what I'm doing today essentially is I'm trying to give pointers towards things that are relevant to design, but more importantly, most important thing I would like to convey is the importance of semiotics. Because semiotics deals with science, and everything we do is built around science. As I said, you think in science, you think in language terms, right? So the most important thing I'm trying to achieve here is to bring about this realization that you should be aware of this. Once you're aware of it, you'll start understanding it better and start applying it in your research. So very quickly again, okay, in the interest of time, I might skip that. So how much time do we have, Pradipto?
You can go quarter past.
Okay, quarter past. Okay, then I'll continue with this. Thanks. So Yeah. All right. So very quickly. So what is this? So there are 3 squares here. So anyone, again, this is sort of a quick game, but I'll try to explain the context of why I'm trying to bring that here. So any guesses? What is this? Okay, so let me move on. I think by now you guys are sort of lost in this. So by itself, this thing means nothing, right? So what we are seeing is 3 squares. There's no clear communication. The bottom line of the squares is not visible, unfortunately, but that should be all right. Now let's say if I add this text up there. So now can anyone tell me what is this?
Cube, I guess.
It's a cube, right? Yeah, no, you're right. So we know the conventions. We know that, okay, one way to represent a 3D object is by its top view, front view, side view. You put it together and you know how to sort of put it together. That's all that is coming from your conventions and norms, right? That's how we represent things. So you can decode it and you know you're sort of deciphering that it is a cube. Having said that, again, you'll see that there is a convention here which says that this is the top view. I've nowhere put an arrow to point that this top view is about this. Similarly, so how you are connecting this to be a top view, this to be a front view, and this to be a side view is based on proximity, right? You're seeing that these 2 things are together. These 2 things are together. These 2 things together. So this, in some sense, you're already. So you're making a lot of interpretations without necessarily being aware of all the interpretations you are making because you're so used to it. The assumption that this refers to this top view is purely based on proximity. I've nowhere said that this is not independent of this, right? Again, this might sound trivial, but you'll see that in many of our cognitive processes, we are so into it that we do not realize all the things that are happening inside, right? So we are building this based on this Gestalt principles of proximity. Similarly here, and of course there's conventions attached to it. Where did the conventions come from? Of course the conventions do not come from nowhere. Somebody started doing this and it made sense. It made sense because of Gestalts, and then it became part of it, and then it became convention. And from the convention now you are able to say it's a cube. And if I were to ask you what is that cube, whether it's a seat or a product, you need more information and all that. Now, if we were to do this by ourselves, that's fairly easy, right? I put it in a drawing in a medium. So I put this, whether it doesn't matter whether I use this in an AutoCAD drawing. So I could, in an AutoCAD drawing, I could use this square, put this text up there and pass it on to you, print out that drawing, and you as the interpreter will understand that it's a cube because I've given you the 3 views, right? Or I could use it on a blackboard. I could just do it on a blackboard, draw these 3 squares. So the medium in that sense is only purpose that it is serving is a visual representation of it, but the communication is only from human to human. So I am drawing it. You as a human is interpreting it. There's no active role of the medium in interpreting anything. Similarly, even in AutoCAD. Now think of it in AutoCAD. So if I do it in AutoCAD, and I draw it, will AutoCAD or the tool or any of these tools by itself understand that this is the top view, this is the front view? If I just label it without having any object connection to it in terms of its database or in terms of there any intelligence in the tool which links these two, right? So if you just visually draw it, a square, and then on top of that write the text as a text box. This is independent text as a string. This is independent drawing as just a 2D drafted drawing. There's no connection between these two on the AutoCAD screen on which I have drawn. So for the tool, it's not a top view. This is just a text, and this is just a shape which is below it, but there's no connection between these two. For the human user, there is a connection between these two because you can interpret it. You're used to doing that. If you want to do the same thing in the computer, right? If you want to bring intelligence into AutoCAD so that if you draw top view right up, if you write top view right here and draw a square box here, for this to build this connection that these two are related, and all this connection that you know when this is a top view, this is the front view and all that, then you can generate an automated cube. you'll have to write quite a lot of things in the interpretation engine, right? And that's not going to be a trivial task. So when you start thinking in terms of imparting all the interpretations you make into a computational system, you'll see how much interpretation we actually make and how complicated it can get very quickly. Does it make sense? Now, if you take this idea that so far many of the media that we used was for human-to-human interaction via a third medium, which was purely for communication purposes. When we are moving into this human-machine interaction, which is also where we are also doing human-to-machine communication, machine-to-human communication, besides human-to-human communication. A lot of this interpretation that we make and we take for granted becomes non-trivial and extremely critical in how we interact with machines. So your human-machine interaction becomes extremely very different than if machines are to be intelligent and be part of the collaboration, the activity. So they are not just passive devices or passive media for representation, but they are actively contributing to the creation of the meaning or understanding of the meaning. Again, I will be careful in calling it meaning, but at least the interpretation engine and all that goes in becomes non-trivial and all that continues from there. Again, I mean, I'm leaving a lot of things and moving on very quickly from one topic to the other. I'm trying to cover a few things, and I'll be happy to discuss that at length when you have time and if you would like to know more about it or discuss more about it. Of course, you can read more about it yourself, right? So one of the things we looked at when we looked at where we talked about a 2D drawing of what was eventually the monitor to gradually moving in there. You see that we moved from something which was more closer to a symbolic representation. As I said, it was not a symbol because the convention was not agreed on. But there are three broad categories of signs that are commonly differentiated. So what you have is symbols, icons, and index. So how do we differentiate between them? So if we go back again to Saucer's definition of signifier and signified, so in the symbols, there is no direct connection, no resemblance between the symbol and the signifier and the signified, right? So this has nothing to do with man or a woman, but we have agreed on. Similarly, A as a font has nothing to the phonetics that we call as A, right? We have just created that symbol and we have agreed on it, and we have got so used to it that it looks very natural, right? A, of course, it has to be A, so, right? Similarly, it has to be man and a woman sort of symbol, but this is agreed on, but there's no direct connection between them. So that's what symbols are. They're fundamentally arbitrary and purely conventional. And since they are fundamentally arbitrary and conventional, there's no other way for anyone who has not seen it before to understand it. So they must know it. If they do not know it, they are not going to understand it in any way. Then we have icons. So these are very useful in UI UX design, and they can be very powerful again. So they show some resemblance. So there's some resemblance between the signifier and signified, and of course you can see with 4 limbs, a head and a torso and all that. Which is similar to, in some sense, there's a resemblance there. Now, that resemblance can be in terms of sound, feel, taste, whatever. But the icons, in some sense, create that resemblance. When we come to index, it's not about resemblance, but there's some direct connection to it, right? So something, for instance, in this case, this is an example of the type it represents, right? So this is an instance of the type it represents. So there's some way where you have a direct connection instead of a resemblance, right? So these three are powerful ways of using things, but again, they have different affordances, right? So here, in order for somebody to understand them, they must have a prior knowledge of what they stand for. Without the prior knowledge, there's no way for them to know what it is. Here, they need to be able to identify what is the resemblance. So the resemblance must be stark, so that it's easier to see the resemblance. Here, the problem that can arise is in terms of whether this is the actual person we are talking about, or is this just a type, right? For example, if now let's say you have a website, and on that website you are showing some people doing some task as part of a project management team, for instance. Now the question could arise is this the actual team for which the website is, or is it just sort of an illustration of some project management activity, right? Which is very common. So we use many of these images regularly on websites and otherwise, right? So if we look at it in terms of coding and decoding, so symbols are in some ways coded, and it requires decoding. So you must have a prior knowledge of the coding and decoding process. Icons lie somewhere in between because of their resemblance. Index can create confusion in terms of the context, which is what I said, whether are they the actual people in the team, or this is just a representation and that the team functions like these, right? So the contextual information becomes important in terms of deciphering indexables. For example, in the case of if we think of that monitor, so are we really talking about that specific instance of the monitor, or this is a representation that this is actually a monitor, right? So I could use any company or any brand. All we have is a representation saying that we'll have a monitor there. Now, coming to some of the other areas. So again, what you should be familiar with when we talk about semiotics is this idea of the different branches of semiotics and how they play a role in the construction of meaning. So the first is semantics. Again, you might have heard the word semantics in many ways. Semantics often is associated with meaning. So the idea is semantics is essentially what they stand for, right? So how so that's the meaning that is created. Syntactics is the structure between the signs, and pragmatics is the relevance, right? Is it useful? Is it relevant to the context, right? Because there can be many meanings, there can be many aspects of structure. So if I'm, for example, if I'm interested in representing a monitor, for instance. Now a monitor can have hundreds of attributes that I can think of, right? Starting from color, material, size, cost, and I can keep the list as long as I want. I can keep adding, right? Reality is very difficult to model as it is. So you can, if I try to be comprehensive in the amount of information that I can add, it can become extremely exhausting, right? But from a practical point of view, I may need only 5 or 6 of those attributes for the purpose that I need it for. So that is the relevance. So it is pragmatic not to try to be super comprehensive, but only have just the right amount of detail, right amount of information so that it serves the purpose. So that is pragmatics. Now, one part I just wanted to clarify, which is very common, is there's a confusion one can get, is difference between semantics and semiotics. So semantics is, as we said, focuses on what is the meaning. Semiotics looks at the overall, saying that how the meaning is created, right? So semiotics looks at semantics, syntactics, and pragmatics together. One very important part in meaning creation, and this again could be useful. So now I'll try to also bring in some tools that you can use. I understand that I'm going very well, there's a lot of philosophical aspects to it which can be confusing, but there can also be some tools which are easier to use. So one of the first things to recognize in science is that it's essentially differential. By differential, it means that you can only understand a sign with respect to its differences with other signs, right? So what it stands for and what it doesn't stand for. How is it different from the other signs? That's how you create identity, right? How am I different from someone else? That's my identity. Similarly, signs have their identity or their meaning, which emerges from its differences with the others. If there is no difference, then it becomes difficult to create a sign, right? So language essentially is a system of functional differences and oppositions, and what distinguishes a sign is what constitutes it, right? So, and it's often useful for almost everything. You will be able to find an opposite, and that's the claim, right? So if you are able to identify the opposites, then the meaning of the signs become more clear. So this is a tool called semiotic square, which allows that to be done. So one way to look at it is, for example, if you have something, what it is not. So this is the, okay, so let's say I have the word good here. So the opposite of good is bad, but it does, when I say it's not good, it does not necessarily mean that it's bad, right? So not good is not the same as bad. But not good is, of course, good and not good have a contradiction, but not good does not necessarily mean bad, right? So there's something called negation, which is opposite, and something which is what it is not, right? So if you go and approach things in terms of, even when you are designing things, when you're looking for assessing things, it's useful to sort of apply this sort of semiotic square to look at whether you are really looking for opposites or whether you're looking for what it is not. So what it is not exactly opposite, right? Which I just illustrated with the example, good, bad, and not good. Then comes the other part of looking at differences. So there's something called structural differences, which is what you see in grammar. So that is a combination of the different elements. And paradigmatic is which is based on substitution, this or this or this. So I'll quickly move into this. So structural or grammaral differences can be seen in terms of sequence, what comes before, what comes after. It could also be in spatial terms, what comes above, below, in front, behind, and all that, right? So that is largely structural. And that is so structural differences is in terms of or structural combination is in terms of syntagmatics, and paradigm is in terms of changes. So I'll go directly with an example in the interest of time. OK, let's go to this example and then I'll quickly go there. So for example, you have a sentence, the baby had slept. Now, these things are needed for it to be a complete sentence. So this is a syntagmatic requirement. So structurally, it makes sense that this combination. But instead of this paradigm where the baby has slept, there could be another paradigm we are talking about. So the baby had food or the baby is cute. Now, these are all different paradigms because they are different meanings and they have different, they're talking about different things. So this is so you could replace these. So you have substitution, which is what is happening in terms of the alternatives. But here, what you have essentially is they are all needed as part of completing the whole, right? So this is the structural requirement. This is here what you have is change in paradigm. So one paradigm is about sleeping, one is about having food, one is about its characteristic as being cute. Now, if we take the same idea in terms of designing an emoji, so one can look at it the same way, right? So you have all three emojis. If I want to break it down and start thinking of design, I could look at it being an emoji is composed of these. So these are the structural requirements for an emoji to be complete. So that are its grammatical requirements. It must have a base, must have something to represent eye, something to represent a mouth. Other things may or may not be required, right? So I change one, I change the eye type and the emoji changes. So it is a paradigm change. So you have expression is changed, but the structural characteristics, they have the basic structural requirements. So there are these requirements that they must have these, and you can keep making changes here. So if any of you did the CED course, you must have come across morphological chart and so on. So this is one way where you can break down your design or your UI UX problem to look at what are its structural requirements and what are the paradigm shifts you can make in the design. Right, where you can play with the combinations, structural combinations, and then your semantic combinations otherwise, right? Or the substitutions that you make. Now, this is again, I'm going very quickly. I have 2-3 minutes left. As I said, I had too many slides. It becomes the whole idea of context, what is being said, and the role of the medium, all of that becomes, and the role of the code becomes important in communication. Essentially, when you are designing, someone else is interpreting, or anything that you are doing similarly in UI UX, there's always a communication. Somebody is doing something, that's the addresser, and somebody is interpreting, right? So all of that interpretation takes place within a context. That is how the message is being evaluated. It's always communicated within a medium, and the medium also determines how well the message is communicated. And there's a process of coding and decoding, right? So the person who's creating the design or who's creating the UI UX has a certain set of knowledge based on which they have certain rules of production and some technical infrastructure. All of that they use to encode what they are doing, and that is communicated. Then comes the person who's interpreting it. They have a frame of knowledge which may or may not be the same as the person creating it, may or may not have the same relationships in the production and how they interpret it, and may or may not have the same kind of technical infrastructure. Again, you can think of technical infrastructure in a more wider way. So it's important that you understand these so that we reach a common ground, so that the encoding and decoding has a common ground, so that it facilitates the meaning creation and meaning interpretation. Then comes the role of medium. I'll skip that. Similarly, we come to modality. I'll leave all of these for the moment. I'll just go to the conclusion in the interest of time. So the first thing to conclude is that sign is not assessed in isolation. Right? So whatever you design, whatever elements you have in the design, no matter what it is based on its relationships in the sign system and as part of the whole. So the awareness of Gestalt theory is particularly important for designers. So please look at that. I've not gone into it. I've just talked about it. Very important again is that understanding the context in which you are designing, who you are designing for, how they are likely to, what is their conventions and codes and what is their practice, that becomes extremely important. And you'll find all of that in the common literature on designing for UI UX. Again, related point, the sign systems, there are traditions and practices in UI UX. There are best practices, guidelines on how to use, and there are conventions and codes. So be aware of them because there's a legacy already established. It's not a new field. It's not a new practice. So you must follow the norms that are there in that discipline. Reality is a social construct that must be represented and interpreted. So again, who you are designing it for, you must know how they are going to interpret it. Signs and meanings are based on differential relationships, which is what we talked about, is not good, is not the same as bad, and so on. So you have, you should be able to use these kind of tools to really look for, what you are designing. For instance, in the case that I initially right up front talked about, that the PhD research where the first iteration was based on 3D centric, 3D first sort of an approach in the interface. That was a misinterpretation because the user said they wanted to have 3D. They wanted to have 3D did not mean that they wanted 3D to be the center of it. They wanted 3D in addition to what they really liked, which is their 2D interface, right? So wanting to have something is not the same as replacing something else, right? So, and so on. So your interpretation and analysis should be thorough in those sense. And again, both structural combinations and semantic combinations, they become extremely critical to give the overall value of the signs. That is what we talked about in syntagmatic and paradigmatic relationships. All right, that was a very quick sort of lecture on semiotics. As I said, I potentially would have confused you more than anything else, but the idea was to sort of get you to at least think about the idea of how we interpret meaning and how do we create meaning and how it is within a context, because that is extremely critical in terms of designing or in anything that you do for that matter. So I'll leave it at that. Especially also that is relevant because many of you will deal with things like virtual reality, augmented reality, and all that. So how do you understand reality becomes extremely important. So the cognitive interpretive aspect of things must be taken and accounted for. I'm happy to take any questions unless we are absolutely lost and not have one.